Thanks, Miljan. I keep wanting to say Mijan. So you
I
said
was French, maybe, yeah.
yes. But thank you so much for inviting me. Um,
Just wondering about it.
and yeah, so I don't like very long introductions, but maybe just a few things. So some of you might find my name familiar. I work predominantly in the world of complexity. So I've been kind of in that space of applied complexity for about 2 decades, dabbling in things like the Cynefin framework, etc. Um, based in South Africa, just in case my accent hasn't given me away yet. And that beautiful French surname that you used, Miljan, is we turn it into Blignaut in South Africa. So, but any case, and I come from the natural sciences, so I'm a meteorologist by training. Only recently realized that I probably studied meteorology because I not because I wanted to understand the weather, but because I almost wanted to be in the weather. And I think that's a little bit about my story as well and where I want to go today. Um, I'll draw some links to team dynamics and structuring and organizing, but I wanted to really focus on, I guess, the interplay between the humans in these organizations, where we are introducing change into, where we are experimenting with these new structures, and the invitation for not only the organizations, but also for the humans within them to essentially rewild. And this is to say also that it's not about having no structure, as you said, Mijan, it's about um, looking for life-giving structure and for understanding that every organization and every team even is unique. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And as you'll see, the topic of the talk is making the path by walking. And the context I want to set for this is this quote by Zach Stein. And I was really touched by this the first time I read it, and it's kind of been one of the primary ways that I've been centering my talks recently, because I think we can all feel this in our bones that we are in a time between worlds. There are many things that's passing away, and it feels as if the new world hasn't quite emerged yet. We're in that so-called messy middle of transitioning. And it's in this space that I believe that most humans really encounter complexity. I've been teaching and speaking about complexity for many years, but it's when I have interactions with people where they really can get in touch with what it's like to be in uncertainty. It's in this kind of messy middle in in transition. And so I thought I'd start there and just talk a little bit about change, because I thought I'd start with this framework by William Bridges, who makes a distinction between change and transition. So he talks about change almost as a point in time event, sometimes precipitated by something from the outside. Other times it can be, something internal, like a realization or just a sense that you're wanting something different. But then following that change event, there's a process. And it's a process that has to do with endings and loss and letting go, this messy middle where you can feel quite lost and confused, and then beginnings, new beginnings. You must probably be familiar with change frameworks that's similar to this. And then some of these transitions I would label as transformative. And so here, very often we would use analogies like this one, so we're caterpillars going through the cocoon into butterfly, and some of it's true, and it's all very beautiful. It's very neat. It's a very neat picture. But I don't know about you. This is not what my life is like. So Mine looks a little bit more like this. And if I'm really honest, it looks more like this. And this is, this is one of the key differences between humans and butterflies, So number one, we're not biologically assured of butterflyhood. We can choose how we engage with these transitions. And we're never only in one cocoon at a time. So, this is just a couple of, the transitions that I could map, that I've been in over the last few years. There's the longer term transitions, the higher level ones. There's, climate change, there's new governments all over the world. I mean, what's happening in the US, huge transition that's impacting everybody in the world, basically. There's recessions, there's just on a lower, on a more personal level, unwinding partnerships, new clients, midlife unraveling. I love how Brene Brown talks about that. This thing that happens to you when you hit 50, that goes along with menopause for some, the woman would know what I'm talking about. I don't know why those two happen all together. For those of our age, many of us are dealing with elderly parents. So my mom is in the final stages of dementia. So there's just all of these transitions happening at once. And when I speak in corporate settings and with teams, people really resonate with this. And they say, actually, what it feels like is this. We are in this messy tangle. We know that change is inevitable, but it feels like it's too much. And so when we talk about things like new organizational structures, introducing agility, working with team dynamics, I think something that I'm realizing more and more is that this is the context that any intervention is happening in. And even a small change can feel like almost the final straw that breaks the camel's back. And yet, this is the one thing that we all have in common as humans. It's change. We are always in transition or in multiple transitions. And so this notion of how do we become more changeable? And this is a question that I'm curious about, not only on an individual level, but also on a team and an organizational level. How do we become more adaptive? How do we create structures that's more adaptive? A few years ago at a similar conference, I spoke about reconceptualizing organizations, not as machines, but as flowing streams. So if we see organizations as flow systems, but that almost requires us to see ourselves not as nouns, but as verbs. And so there's this continuous interplay between how we see ourselves and how we make sense of the world, how we make sense of change and of complexity, and what happens in the teams we are part of, and what happens in the organizations and how we structure. And so even though change is so common, we resist change. And I've been so fascinated by why is this? And when you look at this, there are a couple of reasons. So our nervous systems have been trained to see the unknown as a threat over many, multiple hundreds of years. And also our brain's number one organizing principle is energy conservation. So anything that's unknown, that requires me to learn, that requires me to go into the unknown, it requires more energy. And our brains want to conserve energy. And so there's this famous quote that says, our nervous systems or brain, they tend to prefer a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. I don't know if you've come across this one. And so we're in this really interesting dilemma where change really is the constant, and yet we resist it. There's almost like a biological mechanism that works against us when we're in change. And this starts playing out also when we try and think about new ways of organizing, new ways of work, how we move from, how we move towards teams that can, be involved in a particular project, disband, and then reform. This idea of becoming more fluid seems to be in tension with how we make sense of change. And so a few years ago, I wrote a blog post. For those of you who blog, You always want to go viral. This one very, very nearly did, but not quite. And this is what the topic was. I said, it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in a zoo. And sometimes I change this to say it's hard to respond to a jungle if all you've ever known, or if you're structured like a zoo. And in the past, I had to spend a bit of time kind of explaining to people that the world is more like a jungle than a zoo. Now I don't have to do that anymore. I think we all understand that. And yet these zoo-like structures persist in large organizations. And one of the things that I think makes it difficult for us to transition out of the zoo, to use that analogy, is that jungles are complex. And I want to give a slightly different definition to this idea of complexity than what I normally see. And this is from the Latin word complexus. It means to entwine, to embrace, or to encircle. In one of the other dictionaries, it also spoke about including. So it's this idea of including, entwining, embracing, and almost expanding. So ecosystems, as they become more mature, they become more complex. And so this is all around braiding or weaving or twining together. And complex systems like jungles, they're open. This is one of the key differences between a jungle and a zoo. A zoo is a closed system that we've created. And sometimes when we think of teams and organizations, we imagine them to be closed systems like machines, but they're not. They're always open to the context. Jungles are filled with diversity. So complexity, it's all about diversity. And then it's about richly relational and interdependent contexts. So the difference between something like a forest and a machine, in a machine, the parts interconnect, but not in rich ways. So when the clutch connects to the engine, neither of them change. But when two human beings connect, everything changes. The fact that we are both or that all of us are together in this webinar means we're all going to be leaving here slightly changed. And so there's this rich interdependence, rich interconnectivity that we find in complexity. And so complexity is best thought of as a verb. It's alive. There's aliveness in it. There's these continuously weaving processes and tangling and merging and expanding, and it's continuously creating new potential. Whereas in a zoo, it's the complete opposite almost of this. And to use this as an analogy for how we structure in organizations and how we think about teams, I think is a very rich metaphor to explore. And I think the other thing is that complexity invites us to expand, I almost want to use the word rewild internally, to cultivate greater diversity on the inside, to untame the way that we think about the world, because we need to meet that complexity with complexity. But the zoo mind, it almost puts us in an antagonistic relationship with complexity. And it's interesting, I don't think, over time, we've made complexity this thing that sits outside of us, but actually, we're always in complexity. We are complexity. In almost any sentence where you use the word complex, you can just substitute life. And so it almost puts us in an antagonistic relationship with reality. We tend to resist anything that feels like, it's uncertain or we can't control it. We had a wonderful conversation about parenting and control, just before, at the start of this webinar. And what we see very often is animals that have been in captivity for a long time, when they are released, they're almost scared to leave the cage. And so it's not just so easy to say, go and be agile, or we are no longer a zoo, we're now a jungle, go and be a jungle dweller. Because the zoo very often gets in the mind. And we have all kinds of beliefs like separation. We are separate from other people, individual, very individualist ways. We think in categories. We think in terms of static things. So even when we think of an organization, we think of different business units who are connecting in different ways as if they are static things. as if the organization is a thing. We think in terms of homogeneity. So liking like. Stability, control, and certainty are things we privilege. And so these are things we almost need to unlearn. And this is why I don't believe that new structures or frameworks and tools are enough. And one of the reasons for this is, I have spent the last at least 15 years consulting, conducting learning processes, working with teams, working with large organizations, introducing complexity ideas, introducing tools and frameworks, things like Cynefin, even agile methods and frameworks. And what I've realized is if we don't challenge the rationality, the way of thinking, the way of making sense of the world, of those who seek to apply these new frameworks and structures, they just get conscripted to serve the old linear paradigm. So it almost doesn't matter how good our structures and how good our tools and our frameworks are. If we don't get rid of this zoo in the mind, they kind of ends up never really bringing the change that we're hoping for. That's at least been my experience. And so the invitation here, I believe, is to meet complexity with complexity. And so this for me is about rewilding and untaming, both on an individual level, but also on an organizational or collective level. And it means, well, basically what it says, I think many of us, if we really think about it, we've been domesticated. One of my favorite people to listen to in a podcast is Esther Perel. I don't know how many of you know her. She's a psychotherapist who does a lot of work with couples. But she, in one of the podcasts I was listening to, she spoke about how we've created a form of assisted living where we have apps and algorithms essentially, telling us what to watch next. For example, on Netflix, Amazon tells us what to read next. Waze or Google Maps tell us where to go. It's almost like we're no longer making decisions for ourselves, and I include myself in this. I am very guilty of never allowing myself to get lost anymore, because I just always have Waze switched on, even if I know where I'm going, because I don't want to run into a traffic jam. But so we're unlearning how to be in uncertainty. We're unlearning how to make the path by walking. And we see this in organizations, because whenever you try and introduce something new, some of the questions that come are, where has this worked before? Where have you done this before? So it's basically saying, I want to walk a path that somebody else has walked before me, because I want to make sure that it's going where I want to go. And I believe we're in uncharted territory. I don't think that the current maps will take us anywhere new. And in many of the contexts, many of the organizations and teams, they actually have to find their own way forward. There are no paths. And so some of this rewilding and untaming, some of what this entails is we need to step into this and space. So complexity is where dualities re-entangle. We love to split things apart. There's this Cartesian way of splitting things apart. So we think of structure or flow, but it's both. We think of individual or collective. I think there are many people who would say you only intervene on the system level. Forget about the individuals. You tweak the system and the individuals will follow. I firmly believe it's an and. You need to work on the individual level and on the system and on the collective. It's mind and body. It took me 50 years to discover I actually have a body. I spent so much time in my head. Even my relationship with complexity, the way it was like, I thought I could figure it out. It was all about sense making, but a lot about navigating complexity and uncertainty is embodied. We need to reconnect with our intuitive capacities, for example. And then the rational and intuitive. It's not an either or. But we live in a world, and that for me, it's really this, where the zoo mind really shows up, is we think that it's an or. It's for a long time, I was almost scared to speak about this because I didn't want to be branded as woo-woo because, it's either rational or it's woo-woo. And, I think it's time for us to we need to bring these things back together again, back into harmony. And I believe complexity that is what it's all about. It's a place of coming back together again, of weaving. Another one is to shift from thinking about static things to think about process. And it's really interesting because this is very deeply embedded in our language. The complex view of the world, we see change as the norm and stability as temporary. And so the world is essentially dynamic. We are verbs, we're not nouns. We're always becoming. And there are some indigenous languages that's up to 80% verb-based. I almost can't imagine that because our language is almost all nouns. I find it really interesting that, change, complexity, all of these things, they're nouns as if they are static, which they're not, and neither are we. So I love this quote, Chris Moles, who says, to say the wind is blowing has already made the wind into a thing, but actually it is the blowing that makes the wind. And so I think there's an invitation here for us to reconceptualize how we think about ourselves, how we think about teams, how we think about organizations, not as things or objects, but as processes. As things, or no, see, there I go with a thing again, but as always becoming. This almost frees us up because it completely changes how we think about change. It takes change from something that we want to resist to something that is our lifeblood. And if you think about it, our bodies, just in the time that we've been sitting here, my body is not the same body it was 20 minutes ago when I started speaking. My cells have been renewing, all kinds of metabolic processes have been going on. So it really is true that a human is a bit more like we are humaning. We are not humans. But it's a bit of it messes with your mind because we've been trained to see things that connects to other things and forces that act on those things, not to see everything as process. And then one of the next things that we also need to unlearn, I think, or what we need to learn is to embrace entanglement, interconnectedness, and flow. We're not separate. We don't exist in neat categories. And life emerges in the inter-betweenness and the interactions. It's in that messiness where life happens, where new structures can emerge, where teaming happens. That process of how do we team together, not how are we a team. And here I wanted to show you these two images. It's by one of my favorite artists. You might have seen this before, but his name is Ursus Verli, and he's got this beautiful book called The Art of the Cleanup. And he satirizes this way of being that I kind of term the zoo mind. But this is one of his cleanup art pieces. And I don't know if you can see what's going on there, but, I look at this and it creeps me out. It's like, I have no idea, like if I had to come into a park where everything was neatly organized like this and all the people were like lying, I would think, something very strange has happened here versus this, where we are interconnected. It's slightly messy, but it's familiar. We know that this is what life actually looks like. And yet, very often when we organize, we create contexts that look like the one on the left, even though we strip all of the aliveness out of it. And so rewilding is very much around letting go of the way we've been taught to think. And untaming is very much around remembering who we were before we were taught who to be. And sometimes it can be very difficult. It can be, it's almost like an excavation process. And so I believe the invitation here is to become wayfinders and path makers. And I put in brackets again, because humans have a natural ability to be in uncertainty and in complexity and to make our own paths. Just taking parenting as an example, we had a parenting conversation earlier, so it's fresh. But no two children are the same. Something that worked with your first child may not work with your second child. You can read as many parenting books as you want, but in the end, you have to find your own way to be a parent. And that is what it's like with most of life. We can't explore new territory with old maps, and the well-worn paths lead nowhere new. Nora Bateson, she actually says, if the path is really clear and the future, you can see it, then run, because then that is not the right path. And so the invitation here is to almost be, like the ancient Polynesian navigators. I created a framework called the Ways Finder, because what I saw was that many of the complexity principles and the ancient wisdom that sits in cultures like that, there was a resonance between them. And they were the astronauts of their time. They managed to head into the unknown, uncharted territory, and settle vast tracts of open ocean. And that's in all of our DNA, but we've unlearned it. And I think it starts with just seeing that this invitation is there. And to every now and again, allow yourself to get lost. And when you consider things like, how do we structure? How do we team? How do we collaborate? To see if there are ways that you can find your own way. The Ways Finder framework is all around, we orient, we set a direction, we put in place guardrails, and then within that, we try different things and see what works. And we allow different parts of the organization and different teams to do different things so that we can have some diversity, but within guardrails. And so one of my final slides here is, like swimming, you can't learn wayfinding by standing on the water's edge and thinking about it or analyzing. It's embodied. If you're not moving, you're not wayfinding. And this, I think, is one of the key things, because often what I see in my clients is they analyze, they call in the experts, they consider different ways of structuring, they don't move. And when they do move, they go with one big one size fits all, and in the end, it fails, instead of doing small things and finding your way. And so I believe that's the invitation. Also, just some unashamed marketing. We do have some training courses in this if you're interested. But then I thought I would leave you by introducing you to a couple of lesser known, maybe, authors in this space, that if you want to learn more about this, and kind of go back. So they don't necessarily write about structuring, although I think some of them actually do, but it's just a really interesting, diverse group of people to read. One is a biologist. This book is available for free online. It's called Everything Flows. And as you can see, it's about a processual philosophy of biology. And one of my favorite quotes I put up there for you, it's like, in biology, processes are dynamically stabilized over different timescales. And so it makes it really interesting or easy to mistake these processes for static things. So if you think, for example, of a giant sequoia tree, when that might be there for millennia, it's easy to say it's a thing, but it's still a process. It's just over a longer time scale. So this is a wonderful book to read, especially the first chapter, which is about the manifesto. I would really encourage you to read that. Then Robert Chia, he actually writes about strategy as wayfinding. He writes about organizational change. He writes about structuring as well. One of my favorite articles by him is about managing change by letting it happen. Because basically what he says is change is always already happening. And so here one of these quotes is, change must not be thought of as a property of an organization or of organization, organization must be understood as an emergent property of change, which again, it's very counterintuitive. And then finally, Jean Bolton, she's just published this book. It's called The Tao of Complexity. And in this, she makes a case for what she calls process complexity. And here you can, that quote again, our beliefs about the nature of being and how the world works, it drives our methods and behaviors. And so we have to look at these underlying assumptions and beliefs. We have to untame and rewild for us to be more effective in uncertainty. And then I've recently found more resonance almost with poets than with theorists. And so I thought I'd leave you with this poem. You're probably familiar with it. But every time I read this, I'm struck by the truth of it. So I'll give you 30 seconds to read it. This is my last slide. And then I'm going to open for some Q&A and comments.
Awesome. Thank you, Sonja. So maybe my first question for you to be in context of rewilding, and usually it takes, I'm assuming, few generations for once to rewild something like a wolf. Or what are your thoughts as far as humans, and how long will it take us? Because we've been probably for at least 100 years, but been in a cage, in a sense of, if you think about like how things have changed over the last 150 years. What are your thoughts in context of going away from prescriptive frameworks, from understanding complexity, and complexity being something that's understood in everything that we do, and embracing it rather than trying to control it?
I don't think it necessarily has to take generations. I think maybe in the collective, it takes longer because we're constrained by the systems we've created. I think it's Churchill who says, we shape our structures and our structures shape us. So I think there's in a way we are stuck to some extent in some of these structures we've created. But it's interesting because I think all of us know and can reference somebody that we know who has made significant transformative changes in short periods of time. And sometimes it's one of these transitionary events, so sometimes it's a trauma, sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes what I find is, that it's almost like when people understand that the world is changeable and that it's complex, and they almost choose to unlearn some of these ways of thinking and ways of being, it can actually be quite quick. But then there's an interesting dynamic here, because rewilding to a large extent is about remembering. Because if you think about it, when we're young, we're all pretty wild. We are curious, we are explorers, we're wayfinders, but it's taught out of us. So there's an aspect here also of just, it's already there. We just need to bring it back to life. We all have these skills already, so when we're parenting, when we're in social contexts, we're not there in the Zoom mind, but it's when we're in our work environments where it kicks in for some strange reason. So it's almost like you just need to reconnect to ways of being and to skills that you already have. But I don't want to say it's easy, and it can take a long time. And I think it's much easier, I think, to rewild internally than to rewild a system, an organization.
Is it because it's harder? This goes back to the mindset and the systems, in a sense, that each impacts the way that we think and the way that we perceive things, what we value, impacts what kind of systems and structures we create. So the fact that we live in a capitalist environment where it's all about profits, where it's all about that, how much does that reinforce organizations and reinforce that cage mentality or zoo mentality within the organizations? Because we might be
It
able
has
to change individually. As a leader of a company, you might be able to change, but you're still within a zoo in a broader sense, if that makes sense.
and I think you've just perfectly described the complexity that we're in.
Yeah.
But that is why, on the one hand, I really like that quote I started with, that we're in a time between worlds, because I do think that some of these things that we've just always taken for granted, let's say the bigger zoos,
Yeah.
they seem to be shaking. And it's almost as if something new wants to emerge there as well. But it makes a really, really big impact. That's why so many people are leaving large organizations. And I do think that this is something that we need to figure out how to do, and we need to intervene, on, in the systems, like what, Dave Snowden very often talks about, you need to change the way things connect, change the interactions between things. I just believe, you need to shift away from seeing things and learn or work with the individuals as well. But I think one of the key things that work against us in large organizations are the incentives, the targets we've put in place, the things that we measure. Um, they are all designed for the zoo. It's and so there's a reinforcing loop there.
Yeah. I'm interested, like, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Kuhn cycle. I recently wrote about this, and like what you're describing is like paradigm change. And with paradigm change, one of the things that resonated with me is like, the current ways of doing things start falling apart and essentially not making sense. And if you look at, for the last 10, 20 years, the way that organizations have adopted agile frameworks, the way it's kind of backfiring right now. So I don't know if you're familiar with Kuhn cycle, but is that what you would describe if you are, as far as like this transition between the paradigms?
I think so. And the interesting thing is much of our existing management paradigm is still based on, I would almost say Newtonian physics.
Yeah.
And there's a paradigm shift happening in the sciences. I showed you, that one book, the biology book. But in physics, in chemistry, in biology, science is shifting, it's changing. And yet in management science,
Yeah.
we haven't taken into account, even some of the things, for example, in quantum physics, in quantum mechanics. We still think of that as woo-woo. So I think there's a sense here that the management paradigm almost needs to catch up to what's already happening in other sciences.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Great. Anybody else? Does anybody have a question or anything comment for Sonja?
Sonia, how do we get to bigger complexity one more time when we are looking at this on the individual level, which is personal alignment, versus what is happening in the companies and a social, let's say, a psychology matrix where things are more harder, when we have a herd mentality, when there is a fear that blocks us. So how do we actually move from this fantastic thing that you shared with us? And we are all a little bit better and deeper persons after this, but still on individual level. What do we do with the herd?
I think if I had an answer for that, I'd be quite rich. But one of the things, it's one of the reasons why I created the Wastefinder framework. And I think one of the reasons for the herd and one of the things that really is destructive in organizations is that it feels like people feel they've been stripped of agency. And I think if we can start thinking about not removing structure, because this is one of the things, if you understand complexity, and especially when you look at human systems, hierarchy emerges naturally. I'm not anti-hierarchy, And I think this is, one of the things that we often see when we talk about structures is we need to get rid of the hierarchy. For me, the question is, how do we create life-giving structures? How do we create adaptive hierarchies? And one of the things that I'm trying to do with the Wastefinder, for example, is can we, by creating a safe space for exploration, by making our boundaries very clear, where are we going? Where can't we go? What is our intent? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And we allow for autonomy within these large organizations, for different teams or for different leaders. That already goes a long way in shifting the culture. But I think we need to look at things like what we measure, how we incentivize, how we're, it's sometimes we create schizophrenic organizations. We say one thing, but then everything we do says that, we say we value this, but then everything we do actually shows we value something else. Absolutely. And so I think we need to be intervening on multiple levels. I just think we are missing a beat if we are completely ignoring the individuals in all of this, especially, and this is the other interesting thing is when you start thinking about rewilding, it's how do I help the individuals to step out of seeing themselves as individuals and chasing their own individual, like benefit, and start seeing the interconnectedness between things. And so this is why, complexity for me is always about an and. It's about the individual and the collective. It's about the structures and the processes. It's about, we can't ever just focus on one. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Not easy, though.
Anybody else? Any questions? Here we got a minute and a 5-minute buffer.
Not easy, but perhaps the most natural thing we could do, because to your point, there's nothing new here. There's nothing to learn. I just wanted to say that I loved your talk. It resonated so much with me. And I think what you're describing is the future of work, and that we will either get there willingly, make a choice, or we will be forced to get there as a species, or we will not make it, because it is our ability to come together for the whole, it's like, is the ant the organism or is it the hive, right? Is it the colony?
Yeah, that is it's like it's where do you draw the boundaries? It's a bit, if you think of a family, like where does a family start and end? It's we can say it's the parents and the child, but then what about the extended family? Or what about the friends? What about society? What about the devices that they're on? It's as you say, it's inherently interconnected. And I hope it is the future. I really do. Because as you say, we may still have a choice now, but I don't know for how much longer.
All right. Anything else? This was great, Sonja. So really appreciate
I have another one. Sorry, Mia.
Sure, yeah, let's
if it's possible.
Time box it for a few minutes. Yeah. We have
Yeah.
I need to take a break. Maria will start in 4 minutes, but let's try to squeeze in one more question.
Thank you, Miljan. Sonja, really quickly, we are a great audience. We understand, we empathize, we all want this. When you use this in your work, when you try to explain this to the audience that is not quite open or knowledgeable, what are the things that you see that are a biggest fight back to this? What are the biggest constraints that you see?
So a few, people tend to confuse complexity with chaos. And when you start talking about releasing constraints, it's almost like they see the jungle as a chaotic space where they can have no control and it's unconstrained, and that's the one of the pushbacks. And so there it's very much around essentially, explaining the, different kinds of constraints and the benefits of allowing for more autonomy in your organization, because it also unleashes a lot of creativity. So I think it's that. And then I think it's also just understanding the enormity of it, because when you really understand, then it's like, well, then we need to rethink so many things. We need to rethink how we incentivize people. We need to rethink how we structure. We need to rethink how we lead, so I think that is quite scary. So that's why I really like the kind of wayfinding message. You can take small steps, but you need to start moving in a particular direction. But I think most of the pushback comes from the perceived loss of control. If you really start acknowledging and thinking about complexity.
Yeah, there is nothing in it for them. There is no skin in the game. There is no pain and there is no gain. It's a difficult thing to win. Thank you.
But I do think, I'll just tell you what I'm seeing. In many of the organizations I work with, there is now enough pain. And the complexity, they can see the complexity play out. And they know that the current way that they're managing and the current methods are not working, but they don't know what else to do. So I think there's more of a burning platform than there was a few years ago, and more of an understanding of complexity. Now it's more of okay, we get it, it's complex, but what must we practically do? And that is what I'm trying to focus on at the moment with the ways finding approach.